Hi class, it's Audrey. I'm here at home in my office and I'm just going to do a little bit of a lecture for chapter 8, which is going to be the first chapter that you guys are reading after spring break. So this chapter's on the clients. And first of all, it's probably important for you to know, we talked about this before, about the terminology. I usually call the people I work with clients, but other people call them other things like consumers, the customer even, although that's more like a store kind of a thing. Member, I have one of my interns works at a place where they call them members. A patient is usually what we call people in the hospital, but I do know counselors who call the people they work with patients. So there's different terminology. It's based on what setting you're in and what people want you to use. Your client doesn't have to just be an individual. It can also be a small group of people. If you're working with a couple, your client is both of the people. And if you're working with the family, again, your client is the family. We also want to look at things holistically. I'm sure I've used that word before, which is the whole person, what is going on with them psychologically, biologically, their cultural background, their social situation, who they're living with, their financial situation, their vocational situation, their educational situation. Also, we always ask things about people's coping strategies, if they do have a religion, if they're spiritual, and of course you want to know people's health status, if they have any medical conditions, housing issues, legal status, stuff like that. So those are things to consider when you're working with a client. They have a case study about Mary on page 194 and 195. I thought it was kind of interesting. With her, I think she had mobility issues. So these are things that you would do, you'd find out when you start working with a client. So the intervention is basically what services the client receives from your agency, and things that you want to know about are like mobility. When they talked in that case study, it was about mobility issues. This woman cannot move on her own, so there's physical limitations. Some people have transportation issues. I used to work at a clinic where a lot of people had they would get the ride or some sort of transportation because they couldn't get to their appointments unless they had a ride. Another thing is nutrition. Like, we want to ask people if they're able to eat properly, if they're gaining weight or losing weight based on a poor diet. Elimination and urination. In that particular case study, they did talk about that because the client could not use the bathroom on her own. So that's an important thing to know. Daily living is in the next slide. I talk about ADLs, which is what you want to know from the client is like, are they able to get dressed by themselves? Can they bathe by themselves? Can they do things that we all have to do to be functional? Can they do it on their own? Safety, that's mostly is a client safe on their own. It's not just whether or not they're suicidal either. It's also like, can a client be safe on their own? Like, for instance, if someone has Alzheimer's, they might forget to turn the stove off and they could burn the house down. So that's a safety issue as well. And obviously someone with mobility issues might not be able to like go up and down stairs. So there's other issues of safety. A spiritual assessment, you always ask people if they have any beliefs and how they practice them. The cultural assessment is trying to understand your client's background and use that as a strength for them, making sure that you're consistent and aware of their cultural practices. This is an important thing, ADLs. I'm pretty sure I talked to you guys about this. ADL stands for Activities of Daily Living. This is about whether or not your client is eating and sleeping regularly, if they're getting dressed by themselves, if they're brushing their teeth, if they're showering, if they're washing their hair, if they're using the bathroom properly, and if they're doing tasks that they need to do to function at home and to function in society. When I worked in the emergency room, this was something we always asked people. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you taking care of yourself? And if someone smelled badly and smelled like they hadn't showered in several weeks, then we knew that they probably needed more help with being hospitalized because they weren't able to take care of themselves on their own. So defining the problem. When you work with a client, a lot of times I usually just ask people outright, like, why are you coming to counseling? What is it that you want from this relationship? But really what you want is for them to define it on their own terms. So you're going to have your own perception of the client's problems, but it's also very important what their perception of the problem is. So you want to ask them what's going on from your point of view. You can make your own assessment, but you really want them to be driving the car, if you will. Problems of living we talked about, I think, in the first chapter of the book, which is basically about like all the problems that people are facing. And right now, honestly, with what's going on with the pandemic, a lot of people are probably experiencing a lot of pain based on, being quarantined and being out of work. It's stressful. It's difficult to predict what an individual will experience as a problem. So there's some people that if they were homeless, that would be a big problem. And there's some people that are homeless where that's not a huge problem. And I've actually met people that are homeless and that's just like part of their life and they're used to it and they're not trying to change it necessarily, believe it or not. So the problem is up to the eye of the beholder. So if someone thinks it's a problem that they are, single and divorced, then that's a problem in their life. But if it's not an identified problem, that's different. So individual perspective is part of the problem definition. So you really want to understand your client's definition of the problem. The other thing, of course, is that clients may lack the resources or skills to solve the problem. So in other words, if someone is homeless, that doesn't mean they necessarily have the resources to not be homeless or even the skills to solve that problem. So at the very least, even though you can't pay their rent, you can help them find how to talk to the right people about housing and how to get on the list for, Section 8 and what they can do, connecting them with shelters and such. Some problems may be managed by the client, but not solved. So that could be something like having diabetes, like it's something you have to manage, but you can't solve diabetes. It's not really curable, at least not yet. So there are some problems that are just not solvable. If someone's divorced or goes through a breakup, you can't necessarily solve that problem, right? Because they might just be like, that's that, but you can help them manage that part of what's going on in their life. So really what we're trying to do is we want to understand how the client identifies the problem and then kind of go from there, not just make our own assumptions about what is a problem. This is important stuff. Hierarchy of needs. This was big when I was in grad school. We talked about this a lot. Maslow, the hierarchy of needs. So there's probably some YouTube videos on this. It's pretty interesting stuff. I didn't have the right way of doing this slide that would be good for you guys because so this is actually flipped. If you saw the graph, but anyway, the one that's obviously the most important for people is their physiological needs, which is like we all need food and shelter and we need to sleep and we need water. And this is like survival stuff, right? So that's the highest one of our needs. The next one down is safety needs. So we all want to feel safe, right? We need protection and security. We don't want to feel like our life is, we're going to be harmed by people in our life, whether it's crime or domestic violence or anything along those lines. The next part of the hierarchy is social needs. We want to feel accepted and loved by friends and family. Very important. Esteem needs is feeling recognition and independence from people in our lives. Like if you do well in school, like feeling like people recognize that or your parents care about it, or being independent is something a lot of people take pride in, that they want to feel like they're in charge of their own life and they're not dependent on others to do what they need to do. And self-actualization is basically where Carl Rogers talks about this, and this is where your ideal self has some sort of in the Venn diagram actually is somewhat aligned with your actual self. So that means, so if I want to be a PhD professor and teach classes at LaSalle, and that's my goal, and that's what I've always wanted, and I'm actually doing that, then I've self-actualized. I guess, I don't know if that's a good example. But anyway, self-actualization is sort of a state of congruence where basically the person you want to be is pretty close to the person you are, if that makes sense. So, client problems. They outlined a bunch of them in the book. They talk about the lifespan, the developmental process, the stages of life. So that's basically like, obviously a teenager is going to have very different problems than an elderly person. So it's important to understand where people are at phases in their life. Like sometimes I've worked with clients who are of childbearing age, and it's like really important to them that they get a relationship and get married and have children because it's a developmental thing. They're like, I need to be doing this, which is not the same thing that a teenager is going to say to you, or someone who's, in a midlife. They're going to be in a different phase of life. So it's important that you understand that part of how people feel, is where they're at in their life. Situational perspective, that's basically what they were talking about there, is like sometimes problems are based on a situation. So like, right, for instance, the pandemic, like we could say a situation is that, I was in the restaurant industry and I lost my job, and that is a major change, and now I don't have an income and I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent. That's a problem that is situational. It's based on things that are almost out of your control. So accidents, crime, natural disasters, the pandemic is kind of in that realm. That would be a situational problem. Meeting human needs is the hierarchy of needs, which I just covered, actually. I think I flipped the slide. So that would be all the things we just talked about in the last slide. Wellness, strength-based aspects of self. There's another slide I'll talk about for that. Same with environmental influences. And then they talk about power-based stuff, which is, and they mentioned feminism. So I think that's more about when, the social justice component of thing, where a lot of people are very aware now of how patriarchy and capitalism and globalization affect our lives and create problems for people that are trying to make a living. So the wellness model of the self that's in the book, they talk about these different selves, which I thought was actually kind of cool. The creative self is what makes us unique and how we express ourselves. So if you're doing music or, writing poems or doing anything that is creative, that would be that part of yourself. The coping self is how we survive in our environment. So that would be, how are you coping right now being in isolation? That would be your coping self. The social self is how you relate to people in your life, connections with your friends and family. The essential self is a search for meaning in our lives, spirituality, worldview, kind of the more macro. And the physical self is nurturing the body, having good health, good nutrition, exercising, basically keeping your physical body healthy. Environmental influences, I actually, even though Bronfenbrenner is not in this book, I would love it if you guys would watch that YouTube video. I actually showed it in HS101, so you might actually see it again. But good thing to understand. The ecological model is basically the individual is in the middle of a circle, the nucleus of the cell, and around that is the family, and then social institutions like schools, workplace, etc. And then there's like the global situation. And it's described far more in detail in Bronfenbrenner. So the idea basically is that your environment influences you. So a person might have a problem, but it's not just about the individual, it's about the influences upon them. So their family might be like, you know what, you can't live here anymore because we have elderly people in the house and you might bring back, germs or whatever. So that is an environmental situation in a way, right? Because it's like not completely just about the individual, it's about their environment. If that makes sense. How clients get help. When clients need help, how do they find it? So, well, not all people get help, quite frankly, and not all people ask for help. So usually we refer people, so people can either self-refer for services or they get referred by somebody else. Usually people get referred. But there's also involuntary clients. Those are kids, people you see at school for bullying or something, or in prisons. A lot of times they're court mandated. Protective services like DCF, juvenile. A friend of mine got divorced and she was mandated to go to like some sort of parental class. That's involuntary. And then inadvertent services is when you're treating an entire group of people and a person just happens to be a part of that group. So if you're treating, you work at a homeless shelter and someone's homeless, they get services through that. Barriers to seeking help. Some people have problems but choose not to seek help. Some people have financial issues. They don't have insurance. There's a stigma. And some people are reluctant. They just don't want to ask for help. And the other thing to think about is clients' expectations. Some people think that you can solve their problems, but you can't. You just help them try and solve their own problems. And then most clients evaluate services after they have them. Not necessarily in private practice, but in other services, they would actually evaluate how they felt the agency did so that you can get feedback. So this is my 15-minute lecture. That's as long as I can record here, so I'm going to stop now. If you have any questions, please email me. Also, make sure you do the discussion board. Every week you have to do this lecture, which I can tell if you've seen, and also do the discussion board and anything else I post in each module, and this is chapter 8, which is for next week, or the first week back from spring break. I hope you guys are doing good. If anyone's stressed out, make sure you get in touch with me. I'll try to help you out. Okay, bye.